afternoon, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get started. We are here today. We're going to talk about the war on drugs and some legalization and decriminalization, and we're going to talk about some of everything. We decided we're going to kind of do our panel discussion sort of interactively, little discussion-y, some of every, just a nice little bit, just kind of flow with us today, okay? So my name is Candace. You guys have sort of seen me and been introduced to me already. The author of the Ebony Exodus Project, Why Some Women Are Walking Out on Religion and Others Should Too. I also contributed to a book called Women versus Religion. Deanna Adams has also contributed to it, and I think Hypatia as well. And it's copies of it are floating around here somewhere. Anyway, point is, my background, I'm a mental health professional, and I work with, right now I'm the clinical director of an all-boys group home. So I work a lot with teen boys who are like court-ordered into treatment, they're court-ordered into placement. They may be there for, like I got a boy who's there right now, he's a felony, attempted murder, grand theft auto, he's on an ankle monitor, that sort of thing. So I work with teens on all kind of my present work, teens, all kind of stuff. My activist work, I got into the field again, I got into this work with, like I said, my research on Black women and mental health issues and how religion is contributing to, those issues, and, the idea that, we're the most religious demographic in the country, yet we kind of suffer from some of the worst, issues, health, wealth, all of those things. We kind of suffer from some of the worst issues in the country as well. So my research that kind of got me into why I'm here today started out as sort of that Black women mental health issues. And then, like I said, just as I've grown professionally, what I discuss and what sort of things I address from a secular humanist perspective also kind of goes along with my clinical work as well. So that's how I end up, dealing with, Black women issues, but also Black families, children, teens, some of all those things. And so as we're talking about war on drugs, I do some activist work around the school to prison pipeline issues and how, especially with our minority children, issues in school, how that leads to them, just the system is designed for them to end up in prison, in jail, that sort of thing. So I kind of talk about some of that as well in my activist work. And so anyway, so I blend all that in our discussion today about war on drugs.
Hello, everyone. My name is Rajani Gudlavalleti, and I use she, her pronouns, and I live in Baltimore, Maryland. I work with Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition. We got new t-shirts that say it very proudly, so I'm wearing it. I am the community organizing manager with Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition, and if you are curious what harm reduction is, that might be more of a conversation for another day. But just because I always have a PowerPoint on deck because it's part of my job, that's not what I want. In case you're curious about our mission statement. So our work is very focused, my work is very focused on Baltimore. I've been a resident of Baltimore. I'm a community member for about 10 years. I'm originally from the San Francisco Bay Area. That's where my parents and my brother are. For a week. And that's where my little immigrant family has made a home. In the Bay Area, but Baltimore's also home to me. And so the work I do is around ending the racist war on drugs, ending anti-sex worker policies, ending overdose, and criminalization, right? Knowing that dealers and sellers are all part of the same communities often, and we cannot throw anybody under the bus, and now that the overdose epidemic is seen as is taking on a more compassionate approach because more white folks have been prescribed opioids and are therefore also experiencing more overdose, which is so deeply sad. So deeply sad. No one deserves that. and especially not the Black communities who have been devastated by the racist war on drugs and overdose for decades. And so, but have been met with criminal justice approaches, right? Punitive approaches that do not save lives and have never been about saving lives. So I'm very passionate about that work, and that is the work I do. So I lead community conversations in mostly Black neighborhoods. Baltimore is like a 70% Black city, so it's very much like the pain around the current approach to opioids and overdose is so, it's visceral. And so it seems like, I hate using the word calling, for some reason that is the word coming to my mind. It feels like that is where our pain is, and that's where I need to go, right? It's like, we need to address this so that we can save lives. So that's essentially what my work involves: outreach, giving services, syringe services, naloxone, etc. But also really doing community dialogues around history. So I'm a total history nerd, but only history that comes from women of color, people of color, real history of racism and oppression. And so that's a lot of where my work is. I can't talk about that without giving a shout out to a group called Baltimore Racial Justice Action, which trained me, elder Black women, and white folks who had been part of civil rights movement making in Maryland for decades. I've been trained to be a racial equity facilitator and workshop person. And so that's where a lot of my analysis comes from. And then I also started a group there called Baltimore Asian Resistance and Solidarity. I am South Asian Indian. My parents immigrated from India. I was the first of my family born in the United States. I just this week saw my cousin's kids, who are the next generation of Indian American US born kids in Chicago suburbs, and that's super wild auntie stuff. And it's amazing, right? So immigration is part of my existence. Hinduism is what was in my upbringing, and something that's very important to my cultural understanding of who I am, and something I will talk about tomorrow at 9 a.m. if any of you are sober enough after tonight's parties to come and see me. I would love to have you there. So anyway, rambling, but just to say that's who I am. I am atheist, grew up Hindu, hella Indian. This is the work I do, and I'm really excited to talk about racism, I don't know, racist war on drugs and cannabis policy.
And that's the perfect segue to me. Hello everyone, my name is Sonjiah Davis, and can I just indulge just a minute because there's somebody that's very important to me here. I just want to just say hello to my great aunt. She is my last living elder. And to have her here with me today means everything. Start crying. She made it here, and this is like the best thing ever because she just means everything to me, and she is like my ear. She's that person that just keeps me going. So, sorry about that. My name is Sonjiah Davis, and I am a psychotherapist and licensed clinical social worker, and I am in private practice in Washington, D.C. My practice focuses on the LGBTQ plus community. It focuses on, we just had a great presentation by Marquita about domestic violence. I run a group called Sisters in Survival that supports women of color who are survivors of narcissistic abuse and other violent abuses. And I am a former Capitol Hill legislative assistant, so policy is my thing. Today we're going to talk about criminal justice reform. As I am an advocate for women and children, I'm going to talk about the impact that the criminal justice system has had on women of color and how we've had to carry our communities on our backs for so long. And because of policies that lock many of us up, especially for carrying a small amount of just marijuana, how it impacts our entire communities and how us as women of color have had to keep the mantle going but I'm also going to talk about entrepreneurship because I'm an entrepreneur. So you see my table back there. I have the wonderful hair care products back there. But I also have a cannabis business. And I'm so excited, you guys, because, Candace saw my pictures. I just had my first harvest. So I'm really excited about that. But I want to kind of just share some thoughts at the end about looking to participate in this war on drugs, but from an entrepreneurial perspective. Okay? So today we're going to start beginning the history, the past, the present, and the future. Welcome to the Decriminalization and Criminal Justice Reform panel.
Yeah, you can share. So, told myself I wasn't going to rely too much on this, but I really just don't want to get off track. By this, I mean this PowerPoint. So, the war on drugs, getting into history. It's so important as we are watching and participating in the decriminalization and legalization efforts that are going on regarding cannabis specifically around the United States. It is so deeply important to recognize history with anything, right? When it comes to racism, oppression, all of these isms, these are not just interpersonal, right? It's not just that person just said something to me about my hair or my skin. Yes, that's fucked up. That person needs a punch in the face. But that's not all it is, right? When we talk, no punching. Actually, I'm not really like a puncher. I just, okay, fine. Very strong worded statement is what that person needs. But in any case, it's about structural history. It's about structure and history. It's about the legacy of slavery. It's about the legacy of genocide, legacy of violence against Black and brown bodies. That is what racism and oppression is. That is what the war on drugs is. So we cannot just say, oh, it's a failed war or, that sort of thing. It has actually been quite a successful war. Because when you think about what it was designed to do, and I have like a 6-hour workshop that uses this slide, so you're not getting all that, but this is the US racist war on drugs in this timeline. And I really wish I could describe it for everybody, but we'll just say this, that the very first drug prohibition law in the United States was in 1875. 1875, and I hate to admit it, but it was in the city of San Francisco, my home. And that law outlawed opium dens. Opium dens were run by Chinese men. Chinese men who were brought over as indentured labor to build the railroads that we use, right? That has been the catalyst of our transportation system. And this is, of course, 10 years after emancipation, right? So you have this labor drama going in amongst white businessmen who are saying, we need more cheap labor. We can no longer rely on the enslavement of Black bodies. We need more cheap labor. Let's take people from Mexico. Let's take people from Asia. Let's force people into this indentured servitude, low wage labor, physical labor, right? That's exhausting and it's painful. And you know what helps with pain? Alcohol, opium. This is what we do. Humans have been using drugs forever and we will continue to do that. All humans of all colors, all genders, all races, right? So Chinese folks, part of cultural practice was to hold opium dens, which were spaces where people would smoke opium in the safety of community, right? Where they could check in on each other and be like, oh, that person may have had a little much, right? What else does that? Bars. I know I've been kicked out of a bar by a bartender who is looking out for my well-being. That is what opium dens are for. So in 1875, City of San Francisco outlawed opium dens, not because it was dangerous for Chinese folks or anything like that. The actual language said, these are run by depraved, ill people who are ruining the morals of our young white men and women. There's an actual statement in the San Francisco Chronicle from 1875. I nerded out and found it. That is real. It was about protecting whiteness. It wasn't even about the health of their young children. It was about protecting the purity of whiteness that's criminalized the Chinese people. So I'm belaboring on that because that set a stage and a precedent for all drug prohibition in the United States for the past 145 years. So that became a federal law because the Chinese folks were moving across the country, building this railroad, fear-mongering around them. And then as well, there was an increase in, I could get into a whole history thing, but basically then you had more use of cocaine being seen prominently, and you'll see in this that it says, and forgive the language, this is the New York Times from the 1900s, and it states, Negro cocaine fiends. And it got cut off because of space, but it says, attacking white women. Right? This is not, everyone was using cocaine, or not, but this is associating drugs with particular groups of color for fear-mongering, and associating that with violence. Also, you have smoking weed turns Mexicans to wild beasts. I don't know about y'all, but when I smoke weed, that's not what happens to me. I'm usually napping and eating Cheetos. That's just not, wild beast is not a description, right? Again, connecting a drug that is used across race to a specific group of color and violence, and really around protecting women's purity, white women's purity. So those are these laws over time. And then you get to 1971, when President Nixon declared a war on drugs. He stated a war on drugs. Drugs are public enemy number one, mandatory minimum laws, and at that point you see mass incarceration, specifically of black men, skyrocket. I don't have a chart here, believe me or Google it. Mass incarceration, privatization, and capitalist profit over putting away black men in these cages without parole, without probation. Skyrocket. Right? In Clinton's crime bill, all of these bills, Reagan, we talked about that for hours, right? We know how the rest of that goes. And now we have the highest overdose rates ever, right? So we see this history, we know it's not about saving lives. I'm going to read this quote and then I'll move on, but this is history, this is important. This is a quote from John Ehrlichman, who is the counsel and assistant to President Nixon. And he stated this was presented in an article in 2016. He said, the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. You understand what I'm saying? We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or black. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities, we could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. So when we think about drugs, right, and we say, oh, drug prohibition is there to protect us, it's there to save our children, it's there to protect us. Kids are going to be going after it, right? Especially if we don't talk to them about what it is. Everyone's going to be curious about things that are seen as evil, right? This was the point of the war on drugs. It was not failed, it was specifically designed to target black folks and liberal white folks, right? However, when it comes to marijuana, we've had more compassion towards it because the public eye has been more on these young white people using it. So while millions and millions of young black boys and men have been incarcerated for decades for dealing small amounts, if anything, even large amounts, still in prison today, you got white guys with man buns selling it in like a freaking Apple store looking cannabis dispensary, making millions of dollars. And that is because of how this was all designed. It was designed around anti-blackness. And so that is what's important for us to recognize as we talk about our rights to use whatever we want in our bodies. We have the right for that. We also are obligated to support those who have been criminalized for it or who are being targeted with very dangerous drugs, right? Dangerous, chemically, unregulated systems, right, that we design in order, when we have an unregulated system, right, where we don't have dispensaries, where we can get access to things what we know we're going to put in our body, when we have this legal system, then we don't exactly always know what we're putting in our bodies. And so it's also important to know that our risks for overdose are higher when we don't know what we're putting in our bodies. So when we have systems of decriminalization dispensaries run by people who we can trust, who are growing it themselves, we can say, what's in this? Then we know, right? So that's my soapbox. That's the history going on with it.
Well, I was thinking about as far as the history, it's interesting you brought up this quote about from the Nixon era, because there's something very similar from the Reagan era as well. Of course, I don't know the name or the quote or whatever, but they're same sort of thing, where there's like memos and that sort of thing, where we think about like the crack epidemics, and they talk about how like they decided in advance, that like, hey, how can we get this sort of situation under control? And it was like they decided that they were going to start a war on drugs before crack was actually an epidemic. And like part of the way that they went about making it seem bad was to like go ahead and start putting the news out there and putting it in the news and putting it on the newspapers and stuff, that like, hey, look at what's going on, isn't it horrible, all this crack going on? And then of course, then you start arresting people, you start, the cities are getting on board like, hey, yeah, this is horrible, and you start making things worse, and then it starts, then that's when it actually started. So we think about sort of like these ideas of, people were using drugs, and then that's why they came in and made these laws. It was like, no, they were trying to figure out how can we get stuff under control, so let's make the laws to manufacture a system. That's what gets me the most, when I sort of do that research. And then, I don't know, has anybody ever seen that movie? It's basically like a propaganda film. It's called Reefer Madness. Have y'all seen Reefer Madness? Oh my God, I think that we should have done like a screening of Reefer Madness. We should have got really high. Everybody would have got high and then watched Reefer Madness. I watched that like a couple of weeks ago. Like I had come across it in my studies, and I was like, yo. So I'm in my room watching this movie, doing what I do, and I'm like dying, but I'm into it too, because I'm like, yo, he ran over somebody. It was like a hit and run. Like they really make it seem like if you smoke weed, you're going to go crazy. But what I did like about it, I'm going to tell you honestly, what I did like about it was that they used white people. I was like, you know what? This is good. At least they use white people. Because at least they made like the crazy, at least they represented, the craziness as white people can smoke weed and go crazy too. Like, okay, you know what I'm saying? I seriously had that thought, like, okay, at least y'all use white people. That's good. But it was so funny. I was so into that movie. I was really genuinely into it. No, like it was funny, but at the same time, I was like, seriously, like, oh my God, like, yeah, that dude need to go to jail. Like, I was so into it. Anyway. Oh, go ahead.
So we touched on some of the history, and as a social worker, my chosen profession gets a lot of kind of a bad rap, because I hate to tell people that I'm a social worker, because the first thing they say is, oh, you're going to take babies. And unfortunately, that stigma, or that stereotype comes from this history. Because one of my favorite movies, and what kind of prompted me to become a social worker, was Claudine. Does anybody know that movie? And it was Diane Carroll, rest her soul, because that that her spirit is in me, y'all. You saw me, walking around the other day. But the reason it's so important to kind of acknowledge that is because we talk about men not being in the homes because of the drug epidemic, but a lot in the prison industrial complex, or even dying young because of street life, right? But then also the government came in with, welfare. I remember talking to my grandmother before she passed, rest her soul, whatever. and I remember us having a conversation about how Black women weren't allowed to have welfare for a very long time, and how how she struggled, to take care of my mom and my uncle, and that movie is where the gateway until when women of color were able to get welfare. When they got it, they had to go through so much to maintain it. And there couldn't be a man in the home, and you see her hiding, she was dating the garbage man, so the garbage man would, oh, you need a toaster, I found this toaster on my route, buy a rug, simple as a rug to decorate your apartment and make it look nice for you and your children. She would have to hide those things because those were considered luxuries. And the social worker would come in and be like, oh, where you get that from? And, you got too much money coming in, or there's a man in the house. So we're touching on the drug history. The 80s is when crack was introduced. And that was the first time that women were addicted. And then that was even a bigger change in our communities and how our community dynamic was broken up. And so I think talking about that, and I think that goes into you, Candace, and what you're doing. And I've worked with kids too, and I do it in a different capacity. My first job was in a drug rehab for kids, actually, from ages 10 to 18. And I've seen some stories. But Candace, I think you can talk more about the impact that the criminal justice system impacts your clients, right?
Yeah, I think, what is the statistic right now? Something like, what is the I had it written down. Something like 1 in 4 Black men will go to prison at some point within their life, or something like 1 in 4. And like 1 in 15 is in jail right now, or something like that, right? And then the vast majority of arrests and jail time is like simple possession.
Yes.
And then as far as prison time, of course, that starts to get a little bit more serious. But a lot of times, stuff like jail where you might be away for, a year or something like that, or state prison, stuff like that. Those are, possessions, or like, selling, but okay, well, selling how much? It's not like big, huge kingpins, right, that are doing international deals, right? I mean, this is like the neighborhood weed man. This is the local plug that's going away for 5 to 10. And so, like you said, I mean, this is truly devastating the communities of color, and I see right now, I think one of the things that I see that's really interesting is people being sent into rehab or like ordered to therapy for weed, for as simple as weed. And it's almost frustrating, especially with like teenagers. It's really frustrating trying to do therapy with a kid that's kind of ordered there because part of what their issue is they were caught smoking weed after school several times, and because for one they know they are smart enough now. I mean, they got the research. They know that we've been lying, that we've been lying about how harmful weed is. It's not, and so they're looking like, okay, you're gonna sit here and read to me out of a manual and say how bad weed is and try to tell me that it's just like crack and heroin and alcohol, and I know good and damn well it's not. And they'll tell you in a heartbeat, this is better for my ADHD than Adderall, or this helps me feel calm, and this helps me feel this, that, and third. And it's really hard to, the more I learn about it, and the more that I've kind of gotten into sort of cannabis activism, and the more I've learned about it, the harder it is for me to have honest, to work with teenagers. When they come and they talk about, the fact that they smoke weed or that they have in the past, I find it really hard to figure out, like, how am I going to have an ethical conversation with them? Because, of course, they're kids. I can't say to them the same thing that I might say to an adult. So part of the way that I try to have the conversation with them is I try to say, like, yeah, well, you're right, the research says this, the research is starting to change, and, yeah, they are passing it legal, medical in states because they are starting to see benefits, but one of the concerns that they're still having right now is how it might impact a developing brain, and you're a teenager and you still have a developing brain. And so that's kind of how I try to deal with it with them. And even now, even the developing brain thing is becoming a little suspect when it comes to, at least with marijuana anyway. It's different when it, alcohol, yes, developing brain, no good, crack, all that stuff. But because we had an endocannabinoid system,